Hi, this is Linda with Overbrook Quilt Connection, and today I'm doing a little demo on how to put your blocks, finished quilt blocks, together into a completed quilt top. This project is specifically for our beginning quilters class, but it can be used really for any quilt top that you have. So I'm going to put the camera down so you can see the project that I'm working on. So these are some finished quilt blocks that we're getting ready to sew together. And the first thing you should do when you are getting ready to put your blocks together is you should examine your blocks and make sure that if they have any issues that you can fix those issues prior to sewing your blocks together. Now your pattern should tell you what size your blocks should be. So hopefully your blocks will be similar to that, but the most important thing is that they're the same size as each other. So as we know, when we're sewing together, sometimes our seam allowance, sewing things together, sometimes our seam allowances can get a little weird, or maybe our pressing isn't, quite perfect and we have some little pleats and folds and that kind of thing. But if there's things that you can fix on your blocks ahead of time to get them to fit together better, that's always good. So I'm going to use this as an example. There is a place here where this piece does not line up with this piece, and if you use this green as your seam allowance, you will be cutting off a pretty good piece of your corner. If you use this as your seam allowance, then you're going to have a really scant part of your green in that seam. So it's best to try and fix that if you can. So take out these stitches about 2/3 of the way down this piece and ease that in, and then sew it back together to where this edge is more straight. Look at your blocks, make sure that they're all pretty good on the edges, and also make sure that they're the same size as each other, like I said before. Okay, so then when you're ready to sew your blocks together, then you need to look at them to see if there are any seams that will be matching together. And in this case, these two seams will need to be matching each other. So if you're lucky enough that your pattern or your pressing has had those seams opposite each other, which we call that nesting, if we're lucky enough to have that situation, then your seams really do line up very easily because the seam allowances are opposite. But if you have a situation where your seams are going the same direction, then you're going to need to put a few pins in to make this all work. So what I do is I line up my seams so they're directly on top of each other, and then I put a pin directly next to my stitching. And then I put another pin on top of my seam allowance. So, and I do that on both of these. And then I also put a pin at the end of my seam. So then these edges will be held even. Okay, so then when you stitch it, you'll be coming down along this way. When you get to these pins, it's always best not to sew over your pins, but the timing is kind of critical on when to pull those out, because if you pull them out too soon, then your seam allowance can still get kind of wonky as your presser foot goes over it. So when your needle is like a stitch away, and again you're going to want to go really slow as you're going over these, but pull that pin out right as your needle gets to it. Then stitch a couple more stitches so you're over that hump of that seam, and then pull your second pin out and go on to your next seam. Okay, when you're done sewing this seam together, your 2 blocks will be joined, and you're going to do that with all the rest of the blocks in your row, okay? When you're done with that, press all of these seams in this row, all of the seams that you've just done, press them all the same direction. So let's say you're going to press them all to the left, okay? Then when you do your next row of blocks, when you press those seams, you're going to press them all to the right, or the opposite direction of how you sewed your first row. And then that way, when you are joining your rows together, your next row to this row, you're still going to have to pin match these guys if they don't nest, but these will be nesting, and it'll be much easier to control, you know, I still like to put a pin beside it, but with the seams opposite each other, they just naturally nest a little bit better. So I hope these tips have been helpful to you, and I hope that you're very successful in putting your quilt block or your quilt center together. Thank you.